One of them grabbed a 12-year-old boy by the collar and slammed him into a shelf of canned goods, just like that. No warning, no hesitation. Like the child weighed nothing, like he was nothing. The cans scattered across the floor. The boy's glasses flew off his face and cracked against the tile. And the man who did it, big shoulders, rings on every finger, breath that smelled like cigarettes and entitlement, he just laughed, looked around at the terrified neighbors pressed against the walls, and laughed. That was the moment Nia Brooks decided the night was going somewhere nobody in that grocery store had planned for. Not him, not his crew, and certainly not her. If you've ever stood in a room where someone hurt a child and nobody moved, you already know the feeling that took over her body right then. That cold, clarifying fury that doesn't make you shake. It makes you still. What would you have done? Be honest with yourself. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where one person refuses to look the other way, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me your city and your country, because I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The call came at 8:47 in the evening, which was unusual because Mr. Delmont Reeves never called anyone after 8. He was 73 years old, a man of rigid habits, and one of those habits was that the telephone was a daytime instrument. He told Nia that once, years ago, when she was still in law school and doing pro bono work on his nephew's vandalism charge. He'd shown up at the legal aid office in a pressed shirt and hat, and when she'd asked for a number to reach him evenings, he'd looked at her like she'd suggested something improper. So when her phone buzzed and she saw Delmont, Reeves' grocery on the screen, she didn't answer it right away. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a half-eaten bowl of pasta in front of her and a case file spread across the other half. And for a long second, she just looked at the name and tried to remember the last time she'd spoken to him. March, maybe. When she drafted that letter to his landlord about the lease renewal terms. She'd done it as a favor. He'd brought her sweet potato pie in return. She picked up on the third ring. She heard breathing first, then something that sounded like shelves moving, then a voice that wasn't Delmont's, younger, scared, pushing words out fast and quiet at the same time. "Miss Brooks, it's Marcus, Mr. Reeves' grandson. He gave me your number. Please, they're here, and they're—" Something crashed in the background. Marcus. Her voice came out flat and even, the way it did in courtrooms when she needed a witness to slow down and think. "Where are you right now?" "The store. They came in about 20 minutes ago, and they won't leave, and one of them has my grandfather backed into the—" He stopped. She heard a man's voice, distant, saying something she couldn't make out. Then Marcus again, barely a whisper. "Miss Brooks, please. Nobody's calling. Everyone's scared. My grandfather's scared." She was already standing up. "I'm coming," she said. Don't hang up. Keep the phone in your pocket and don't hang up." She grabbed her coat off the chair, shoved her feet into shoes without untying them, and was out the door in 40 seconds flat. She did not call the police. She knew why the neighbors weren't calling them. She knew that neighborhood. She'd grown up 6 blocks east of it, and she knew exactly the kind of calculated fear that made people press themselves against walls and watch and say nothing, because calling meant involvement, and involvement meant becoming the next name on somebody's list. The rain had started sometime in the last hour, and the streets were slick and dark and mostly empty. She drove faster than she should have and told herself she was being irrational, that she was a lawyer, not a— What? What was she going to do when she got there? She didn't have a good answer to that. She had 12 years of Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which had started as a scholarship activity in college, and had never really stopped because she liked the honesty of it. The way your body couldn't lie when it was under pressure. The way skill and composure were either there or they weren't, and no amount of talk could substitute for either one. She also had a particular inability to tolerate certain things happening to children. She'd known that about herself since she was 9 years old, and watched a bigger kid in her neighborhood take a younger one's bicycle, and she'd walked over and taken it back. She'd gotten a black eye for it. She'd given one back. Some things don't change. She turned onto Pershing and saw the lights on inside Reeves' grocery through the rain-streaked windows. The store sat on the corner of a narrow street, wedged between a shuttered laundromat and a barbershop that closed at 6. There were people on the sidewalk, a small, loose cluster of them, not close enough to be involved but close enough to watch. She recognized that posture. that deliberate distance that meant we see this, but we are not part of this. She parked and got out and walked toward the entrance, and nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. An older woman near the door made a small, sharp movement with her hand, a gesture Nia interpreted as "don't." But she didn't slow down. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. A grocery store smell, floor wax and produce, and the faint sweetness of the bakery section near the back. But laid over it was something else. Tension has a smell. Most people don't know that until they've been in enough rooms full of it. She took in the room in the way she'd learned to take in rooms, not scanning frantically, just letting her eyes settle and absorb. The shelves near the front were partially overturned, canned goods on the floor. A cardboard display knocked sideways. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, one of the tubes flickering. 4 men stood at various points in the store, and she clocked all 4 of them in about 3 seconds, where their hands were, how they were standing, whether anyone was moving. One was near the register, leaning against it with his arms crossed. Big, comfortable. The kind of comfortable that comes from knowing you have backup. 2 were in the middle aisle, one of them holding a jar of something, sauce maybe, that he was turning over in his hand like he was considering what it would sound like hitting the floor. The 4th one had Marcus. Had him by the collar, with the boy's back against a shelf. Marcus was maybe 12, maybe 13, slight and long-limbed, and his glasses were on the floor in pieces, and he was trying hard not to cry, and mostly succeeding, which broke something in Nia's chest a little. Mr. Reeves was behind the counter, hands flat on the surface in front of him. He was the stillest person in the room. He looked up when Nia came in, and something passed across his face. Relief, fear, and something protective all at once. The man holding Marcus turned to look at her. "Store's closed," he said. "I can see you're busy," Nia said. She walked further into the store, not rushing, not stopping either. "Let the boy go." He looked at her with the particular expression men like him reserved for women who spoke to them without the right amount of fear. It wasn't anger yet. It was something more insulting than anger. It was amusement. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm a person asking you to let the child go," she said. "We can talk about who I am after that." The man near the register pushed himself upright. The 2 in the middle aisle stopped what they were doing and looked. The dynamic in the room shifted in that small, recognizable way that meant a decision was being collectively made about what this situation was now. "Marcus," Nia said, without looking at the boy. "Step back." The man's grip tightened. Marcus winced. "Lady," said the one near the register, and his voice had the flat, bored quality of someone explaining something to a child. "You need to turn around and walk out of here right now before it gets what?" She looked at him directly. "Before it gets worse than 4 grown men in a neighborhood grocery store holding a child against a shelf? I'm curious what your benchmark is." The man with Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked at his colleagues. He was enjoying this in a particular way that told her he was about to do something stupid to prove a point. He shoved Marcus, hard. The boy stumbled, caught himself on the shelf edge, and the look on Marcus's face in that half second, not fear exactly, but humiliation, the particular shame of being handled like an object in front of someone you wanted to respect you, was the last thing she needed to see. She moved. Later, if anyone asked her to describe it, she would have struggled, not because she couldn't remember, but because the body operating at that level of precision doesn't file memories the way the mind files deliberate actions. It was closer to the experience of music, each moment connected to the next by rhythm and instinct rather than conscious decision. The man who'd shoved Marcus was closest. She covered the distance between them in 2 steps, caught his extended arm before he'd fully retracted it from the shove, and used his own momentum against him. I went down hard between 2 shelving units, and she was already pivoting. The man from the register had started moving when she started moving, which meant he was 3 steps away when she turned to face him. He was bigger than the first one, and he'd been in fights before. She could tell from how he came at her, low and direct, not telegraphing much. She gave ground, just a fraction, let him close the distance, and then she wasn't where he expected her to be, and he was going into the shelf he'd been standing in front of. The 2 from the middle aisle came at her together, which was smart, but the aisle was narrow enough that being together was actually a problem for them, and problems were things she could work with. She went toward them instead of away, which no one ever expects, and what followed lasted about 11 seconds and ended with both of them on the floor. 11 seconds. She'd counted once, in practice, and marveled at how much violence could be compressed into 11 seconds when you weren't trying to win so much as trying to be right. Not one of them was unconscious. Not one of them had a broken bone. She was precise about that. Precision was the whole point. Anyone could hurt someone. The skill was in hurting someone exactly as much as the situation required, and not one bit more. She stood in the middle of the grocery store with 4 men on the floor around her, breathing harder than she would have liked. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline that always came after, and that no amount of training ever fully eliminated. She'd accepted that. The shaking wasn't weakness, it was just the body's honest response to what it had been asked to do. Mr. Reeves was staring at her from behind the counter. Marcus had found his broken glasses and was holding the 2 pieces together with both hands, looking at the men on the floor, and then at Naya, and then at the floor again. "You okay?" she asked him. He looked up, nodded once. His hands were shaking too. "Go stand with your grandfather," she said. She turned to look at the man she'd taken down first, the one who had grabbed Marcus, the one with the rings. He was sitting up, one hand braced on a shelf, looking at her with an expression she recognized, the specific confusion of someone whose understanding of how the world worked had just been contradicted in a very physical way. He wasn't embarrassed yet. He wasn't sure enough of what had happened yet. That would come later. "The debt you came to collect," Nia said. "I want to see documentation, the original loan agreement, the terms, the name of whoever signed on behalf of this store." She looked at him steadily. "Because I'm going to be that man's lawyer, and if that paperwork doesn't exist or doesn't say what you're going to claim it says, then what just happened in here is the least of your problems." The man with the rings looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything. Outside, the rain was picking up. She could hear it on the roof, on the windows, steady and indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. Then she heard something else. Engines. Multiple engines pulling up outside, slowing to a stop. She counted, by sound, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. The particular low rumble of heavy vehicles with expensive suspensions. The neighborhood had gone completely quiet. Not the nervous, watching quiet from before. Something different. Something she'd never heard from a street corner in this neighborhood in her life. Something that sounded, improbably, like deference. Mr. Reeves made a sound behind the counter. Not a word. Just a sound, low and involuntary, the kind a person makes when something they feared more than anything else has just materialized on the other side of a window. Nia didn't turn toward the door immediately. She watched the 4 men on the floor instead, watched their faces. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at the door. And every single one of them, the man with the rings, the 2 from the aisle, the one who'd been at the register, had the same expression. Not fear exactly. Something closer to shame. She turned. The black SUVs were stopped on the street in a line, engines off, lights still on, rain falling through the beams. The doors opened and men got out. She counted 6, 8 more. And they arranged themselves on the sidewalk with a practiced, efficient calm that told her these weren't street muscle. These were people who had done this before in exactly this way. And then the crowd parted. He was not what she expected. He was maybe 40, lean, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that the rain had started to darken at the shoulders. He walked toward the grocery store entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at the scattered people on the sidewalk with an expression that was curious rather than imperious. He paused once, just outside the door, and looked at the windows for a moment, like a man reading a sign. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. He saw the 4 men on the floor. He saw Nia. He saw Mr. Reeves behind the counter and Marcus beside him, still holding the broken halves of his glasses. He stood there for a moment in the flickering fluorescent light, with rain on his shoulders and his hands still in his pockets. And he looked at all of it with an expression that was almost impossible to read. Not fury, not calculation. Something more like recognition. Then, slowly, Kang Min-jae smiled. Not a small smile. Not a polite one. A genuine one, full and quiet. The kind that meant something he hadn't been expecting had just happened, and he found it, what? Interesting. Maybe something more than interesting. He walked toward the center of the store, and the men behind him stayed at the door. He crouched down next to the first fallen collector, the one with the rings, and looked at him for a long moment. He reached out and turned the man's face gently, checking the bruising along the jaw. He looked at the man's wrists. He looked at his knees. He stood back up. He looked at Nia with the same quiet, reading expression. "Which one of them touched the child first?" he asked. His English was precise, slightly formal, each word placed with care. It wasn't accented the way people expected. It had its own rhythm. Nia studied him. She knew who he was. She'd had clients who whispered his name the way people whisper about things they hoped would stay far away from them. She'd seen his name in case files, always peripheral, always just outside the reach of whatever charge was being built. The kind of man who understood how a system worked well enough to stay one step to the side of it. She pointed to the man with the rings. Him. Min-jae looked back down at the man on the floor. Something in his expression changed. The smile didn't disappear exactly, but it went somewhere else, somewhere internal, and what remained on his face was quieter and considerably less pleasant. "Marcus," Nia said, without taking her eyes off Min-jae. "Stay behind the counter." Min-jae spoke then, in Korean, to the men at the door. Two of them came in and started, without ceremony, collecting the fallen collectors, not dragging them, exactly, but not gentle either, and moving them toward the exit. The man with the rings tried to say something. Min-jae said 2 words in Korean, and the man stopped talking. When the last of them had been guided outside, Min-jae turned back to Nia. "How long have you been a lawyer?" he asked. She stared at him. "That's your question." "It's one of them." "I'm not here to have a conversation with you," she said. "I'm here because that man," she gestured toward Mr. Reeves, "called me because he was frightened, and the boy there is 12 years old, and there is absolutely no version of a debt negotiation that requires a child to be put against a wall. So if you want to send lawyers, but we're done here tonight." Min-jae listened to all of this without changing his expression. Then he nodded, once, slowly, the way a person nods when they're filing something away. "The debt is forgiven," he said. Silence. Mr. Reeves made a sound, not words, just air leaving his body. "The men who came here tonight acted outside their mandate," Min-jae continued. He said it calmly, conversationally, like he was explaining a minor administrative correction. "They will be dealt with. The debt is forgiven. This business—" He looked briefly around at the overturned shelves, the scattered cans, "will be compensated for the damage." Nia watched him. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. Because this should not have happened." "That's not an answer." He considered her for a moment. "Because someone inside my organization made a decision tonight that was not authorized, and I would like to know who, and I think—" And here the smile came back, different now, smaller and more precise. "That you and I may have that particular problem in common." The rain was loud against the windows. Nia stood in the wreckage of a grocery store, in the aftermath of a fight she hadn't planned to have, looking at a man whose name appeared in the margins of enough criminal case files to fill a shelf in her office. And he was standing there in a wet overcoat telling her they had a problem in common. She should have walked out, she knew that. She knew it the same way she knew when a client was lying to her, clearly and immediately and with no ambiguity whatsoever. "No," she said. He nodded again. That same deliberate, filing it away nod. "I understand," he said. And then, to Mr. Reeves, "I apologize for the intrusion." He turned and walked to the door. At the threshold, without turning back, he said, "The city has a longer memory than most people believe, Ms. Brooks. What happens inside one grocery store on one rainy night, it echoes." Then he was gone. The SUVs pulled away one by one, and the rain filled the silence they left behind, and the street slowly, cautiously exhaled. Marcus found a broom somewhere and started sweeping broken glass without being asked. Mr. Reeves sat down on the stool behind the counter and put his head in his hands for a moment. Not crying, just stopping. Just letting himself feel the weight of the last 2 hours press down on him, and then, gradually, lift. Nia stood in the middle of the store and looked at the space where Min-jae had been standing. What happens inside one grocery store on one rainy night? It echoes. She picked up a can of tomatoes from the floor and set it on the shelf. She picked up another one. She didn't know it yet. Couldn't have known it. But in less than 6 hours, someone was going to try to kill her. And in less than 8 hours, she was going to be sitting across a table from Kang Min-jae in a diner neither of them had chosen, and she was going to be asking him questions she had already told herself she would never ask. But that was later. Right now, she was putting cans back on shelves in a grocery store that smelled like floor wax and rain and the particular complicated relief of a night that had almost gone very wrong. Marcus swept glass into a dustpan. Mr. Reeves got up from his stool and put on a pot of coffee because it was, he said, the only reasonable response to an unreasonable evening. Outside, Chicago went on being itself, loud and cold and indifferent, and underneath all of that, stubbornly, improbably alive. The coffee Mr. Reeves made was too strong and too hot, and Nia drank 2 cups of it anyway, standing at the counter while Marcus restacked the shelves with the focused mechanical energy of someone who needed to be doing something with his hands. She understood that. She'd been doing it herself, picking up cans, straightening labels, finding small physical tasks to occupy the part of her brain that kept replaying the last 90 minutes and arriving at conclusions she didn't like. Minjae's face when he crouched next to the man with the rings, the way he'd examined the bruising, the specific clinical attention of it. He hadn't been checking to see how badly his men were hurt. He'd been checking how carefully they'd been hurt. That distinction kept snagging on something in the back of her mind like a hangnail on fabric. She kept pulling at it, and it kept catching. "You should go home," she told Marcus. He didn't look up from the shelf. "Almost done." "Marcus." He stopped. He was holding a can of chickpeas and he looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. He had his grandfather's eyes, watchful, patient, older than his age. "Are they coming back?" She thought about lying, decided against it. "I don't know." He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd expected and had at least wanted the honesty of hearing. He set the chickpeas on the shelf, precisely, label facing out. "My grandfather never borrowed money from anyone, in his whole life. He always said debt was a door you shouldn't open because you never knew what was going to walk through it." Nia set down her coffee cup. "Did he tell you where the loan paperwork came from?" "He says he never signed anything. He says a man came in 6 weeks ago and told him the building had a new investment group behind it, and there were fees associated with the transition and that it had all been arranged." He picked up another can. "He didn't know what that meant. He's 73. He thought it was like a homeowners association situation." Nia was quiet for a moment. "Do you still have the paperwork, whatever they left him?" "He has a folder. He keeps everything." "Tell him I need to see it. Not tonight, tomorrow morning." She pulled out a card, her real card, not the after-hours one, and set it on the counter. "Tell him to call me before 10 and not to show that folder to anyone else." She left the store at 11:40. The rain had settled into a steady, unremarkable drizzle, the kind that doesn't feel serious until you realize you've been standing in it for 5 minutes and you're completely wet. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it, watching the street. Nothing moved. The cluster of neighbors who'd been watching earlier had dispersed. The corner was empty and dark and looked like a corner again. She drove home through wet streets, and the whole way there she had the specific prickling sensation on the back of her neck that she associated with cross-examinations when she knew the other side had something she hadn't seen yet. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the feeling of a gap, the sense of a thing that should be visible that wasn't. She got home at 12:15. She unlocked her apartment, stepped inside, took off her wet coat, and stood in her kitchen for a long moment doing absolutely nothing. Then she went to her desk and pulled out the 3 case files she had that mentioned, in any capacity, any variation of organized debt acquisition in the South and West Side neighborhoods. She wasn't looking for his name specifically. She was looking for a pattern. She found it at 2 in the morning, and when she did, she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a while. 6 different businesses over 14 months. Not all grocery stores. A dry cleaner. A family pharmacy. A small furniture repair shop that had been in the same family for 30 years. All of them in a corridor that ran roughly 6 blocks wide through 2 adjacent neighborhoods. All of them with the same story, paperwork they hadn't signed, fees they hadn't agreed to, and then collectors who showed up not to negotiate but to intimidate. 6 businesses. None of them had gone to the police. 2 of them had closed permanently. She put the files down. At 2:27 in the morning, someone knocked on her door. Not a polite knock. Not the tentative tap of a neighbor who'd heard something. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate. The knock of someone who wanted you to know they were there and were comfortable with you knowing. Nia stood up from her desk without making a sound. Her apartment was on the 4th floor. The building had a buzzer. Nobody had buzzed up. She crossed the room in her socks, making no noise, and stood to the side of the door rather than in front of it. "Who is it?" A pause. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Male, low, calm. "Ms. Brooks, my employer would like a word. We can do this here or somewhere else. He says the choice is yours. Your employer has a phone. He prefers this." She looked at the door. The lock was engaged. The chain was on. Neither of those things meant much to people who knocked on fourth-floor doors at 2 in the morning and considered a buzzer system an optional step. "Give me a reason," she said. Another pause. "Someone put a tracker on your car tonight while you were inside the grocery store. We found it and removed it. My employer thought you should know." She stood very still. "He also thought you should know that the same person who ordered those collectors into the store tonight has been watching your movements for the past 11 days. The voice on the other side of the door was completely level. No urgency in it. No attempt to frighten. Just information, delivered plainly. "My employer believes you may be in danger tonight, Ms. Brooks, and he wanted to tell you that in person rather than through an intermediary." She looked around her apartment, the files on her desk, the window that faced the street, the gap under the door where the hallway light came through. She took the chain off. She opened the door. There were 2 men in the hallway, both in dark coats, both standing at a distance that was professionally calculated to be non-threatening. Neither of them was Minjae. "Where is he?" she said. "Downstairs." She grabbed her coat. The black SUV was parked directly in front of her building, engine running, and Minjae was in the back seat with a paper coffee cup in his hand that he wasn't drinking from, just holding. The door was open when she reached it, and she got in and the door closed behind her, and she told herself that getting into the car of a man whose organization had just sent collectors to intimidate a 73-year-old grocer was not the most reasonable decision she'd ever made. She'd made worse. "You removed a tracker from my car," she said. "Yes." He was looking straight ahead through the windshield. "How did you know it was there?" "Because I had men watching the grocery store tonight, before you arrived." He turned and looked at her, and in the dim interior light his expression was difficult to read but not closed. "I knew something was going to happen there tonight. I did not know what." "You knew your men were being sent to do something they weren't authorized to do, and you waited to see what it was." "I suspected. There is a difference." "Not a very big one." He accepted that without flinching. "No, perhaps not." She watched him. He didn't look like a man performing calm. He looked like a man who was actually calm, which she found more unsettling than the performance would have been. Performed calm had tells. You could work with tells. "Who put the tracker on my car?" she said. "That is what I'm trying to determine." "But you have a guess." He was quiet for a moment, just long enough that she knew the answer was yes, and he was deciding how much of it to share. "Inside my organization, there is a person who has been building something for approximately 18 months. A secondary structure. Operations that mirror my own but exist outside my knowledge and outside my sanction." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Tonight was not about collecting a debt. Tonight was about testing how I would respond. And about something else." "Something else?" "The businesses in that corridor. The ones being consolidated under fraudulent loan agreements." He looked at her. "Whoever is doing this needs those properties. Not the money from them. The properties themselves. The locations." She thought about the pattern she'd found in her case files. The 6-block corridor, 2 neighborhoods. For what? "I don't know yet." He said it like it cost him something, like not knowing was a specific kind of pain for him. "But I know that someone used my name, my organization's name, to build the paperwork trail. Which means when this comes apart, and it will come apart, the collapse is designed to land on me." The engine idled. A cab went past on the wet street, its light reflecting in long yellow streaks across the pavement. "You came to my door at 2 in the morning, Nia said, to tell me that someone inside your crime syndicate has been running a shadow operation in my clients' neighborhoods using your name, and that they put surveillance on me, and that you'd like my help figuring out who it is." "Yes." "That's what you're asking." "Yes." She laughed. It came out shorter and sharper than she intended. "Mr. Kong. I am a criminal defense attorney. I am not. You are the only person outside my organization who has seen both sides of this tonight," he said. "And you are the only person I have encountered in a very long time who, when faced with 4 men twice her size, Took them apart with enough precision that none of them needed a hospital. He paused. You were not defending yourself tonight. You were making a point. She looked at him. The point was that precision is a choice, he said. That restraint is a choice. You could have hurt them significantly more than you did. You chose not to. He finally took a sip of the coffee, made a small face that suggested it had gone cold, and set it in the cup holder. I recognize that kind of thinking. I have spent 20 years trying to maintain it in an organization that would prefer I didn't. She sat with that for a moment. That's a very interesting thing for you to say. It's true. A lot of interesting things are true. That doesn't make them relevant. Someone tried to have you killed tonight, Miss Brooks. His voice didn't change. Same level tone, same measured pace. The tracker on your car was not placed by someone who wanted to know your movements out of curiosity. The device was a model used specifically for coordinating a mobile operation, meaning someone was going to follow you home and act on that information. He looked at her steadily. My men intervened, but I cannot guarantee they will be in position to intervene again. She thought about the prickling sensation on the back of her neck on the drive home, the gap she'd felt, the thing that should have been visible that wasn't. She had been right that there was something she wasn't seeing. She just hadn't considered that what she wasn't seeing was the car behind her. No, she said. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man confirming something he'd already calculated for. Understood. I'll be careful, she said. I'm good at being careful. The man I suspect of doing this, he said, as she reached for the door handle, is not someone you can be careful enough around. He is very good at finding the place where careful stops. She stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. Who is it? His name is Han Seok Rim. He has been my second in command for 9 years. He said it quietly, without inflection, in the way of someone reading a medical diagnosis aloud. He is also the man who, 6 weeks ago, personally arranged the first delivery of fraudulent loan paperwork to 5 different businesses in that neighborhood. I did not know this until 3 days ago. And when I began asking questions, your name appeared in a file he had been maintaining. Now she turned. Why is my name in his file? Because 14 months ago, you won a case. Min-jae looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between respect and apology. A civil suit against a property acquisition company. You argued that the acquisition had been conducted through fraudulent means, and the judge agreed. The property reverted to its original owner. He paused. That property was one Han Seok Rim needed. You took it from him before he knew he needed it. He has not forgotten you since. The rain pressed against the windows. Inside the car it was warm and very quiet. Nia sat back against the seat. She thought about the 14-month-old case. She'd won it on a technicality, mostly, a failure to properly disclose the beneficial ownership structure of the acquisition company. She'd considered it a minor victory, a procedural win. She hadn't thought about it since. Someone had been thinking about it since. Get out, she said. Min-jae's eyebrows moved slightly. I need you to get out of the car, she said. I need to sit here alone for a minute. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened his door and stepped out into the rain without a word. And she sat alone in the running SUV with the rain on the roof and her hands in her lap, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her first martial arts coach had taught her when she was 19 and angry at too many things to count. You can be angry. You just have to breathe first. She was angry. She was also, underneath the anger, something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. The feeling of a shape you've been walking around without knowing it was there, and then someone turns on a light, and suddenly you can see all the edges of it, and you realize it's been there the whole time, and you've been orbiting it without knowing. Someone had put her in a file, had been watching her for 14 months, had put a tracker on her car tonight, 3 hours ago, while she was inside helping put cans back on shelves. She breathed. She knocked on the window. Min-jae opened the door and got back in, rain on his coat, and didn't say anything. I need everything you have on Han Seok Rim, she said. Not who he is in your organization, what he's been doing, the properties, the businesses, the paperwork trail, everything. He was quiet for a moment. That is not a small ask. No, it isn't. She looked at him. And when I have it, I'm going to determine whether there's a legal case to be built. Not for your benefit, for the families that have been losing their businesses for 14 months. If there's a case, I'm going to build it through legitimate channels. I'm not going to be your operative. I'm not going to be your ally. I'm going to be a lawyer doing her job. And if that overlaps with whatever you're trying to do, that's the extent of our arrangement." He considered her for a long time. "Agreed," he said. She got out of the car. She went upstairs and locked her door and put the chain back on and stood in her kitchen for a long time before she did anything else. The files were still on her desk. The cold remnants of bad takeout pasta were still in a bowl on the table. Everything in her apartment was exactly as she'd left it 2 hours ago, and none of it looked quite the same as it had before. She slept 4 hours. Not well. In the morning, she called Mr. Reeves before 9. The meeting at his store was brief and quiet, and Marcus sat at the counter with better-taped glasses and didn't say anything while Nia went through the folder his grandfather had kept, page by page, in the thin morning light. The paperwork was sophisticated. She'd give Han that. The documents were formatted correctly, referenced real legal instruments, bore the names of holding companies that she'd have to spend time tracing. But there was a signature on page 3 of the loan agreement above Mr. Reeves' name that was slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to be obvious. Wrong enough that if you'd spent 11 years looking at the way scared or confused people signed documents that they didn't fully understand, you could see the difference. The signature was too neat. Mr. Reeves, who had thick arthritic knuckles, did not have neat handwriting. She'd seen his signature on the letter she'd drafted for his landlord. She knew what his handwriting looked like. This was not it. She photographed every page with her phone. "Don't let anyone else see this folder," she told him. "Put it somewhere safe. Not here at the store." He nodded. He didn't ask why. He trusted her in the way people trusted her when they'd run out of other options, which was not the most comfortable kind of trust to carry, but it was the kind that came with the job. On the way out, Marcus caught her at the door. "Miss Brooks?" He said her name carefully, the way young people said the names of adults they were uncertain about. "The man last night, the one in the coat. He scared my grandfather more than the 4 guys who came in and broke things." He paused. "Should we be scared of him?" She thought about Minjae examining the bruising on his fallen collector's jaw, with the eyes of a man cataloging a mistake rather than an injury. "Stay close to your grandfather," she said. "Don't go anywhere alone for a while." Which was not an answer, and Marcus was smart enough to know it. By 11 that morning, Minjae's man had delivered a drive to the drop location they'd agreed on, a particular coffee shop on Michigan Avenue where she'd be indistinguishable from 100 other people working on laptops. She spent 3 hours going through what was on it, and by the time she was done, her coffee had gone cold twice, and her left hand, which she tended to press flat against surfaces when she was thinking hard, had left a pale, damp print on the table. It was worse than she'd thought. The property corridor was not 6 blocks wide, it was 14. The fraudulent loan operation had been running for 22 months, not 14, and it had touched 31 businesses. 31. She'd found 6. The other 25 had either capitulated and were paying fees to a holding company with 4 layers of corporate structure between it and any identifiable owner, or they had closed. The end target, the thing all these properties were being consolidated to enable, was a rezoning play. Someone had been quietly purchasing or controlling, through fear and fraud, enough contiguous commercial real estate in those 2 neighborhoods to force a redevelopment petition that would bring in outside money at 8 times the current property values. It was elegant in the way that genuinely ugly things sometimes were. You didn't need to buy the properties. You just needed to control the people who owned them. You needed them afraid enough to pay whatever you asked and too isolated to organize any response. Then, when the rezoning petition went through, you stepped out of the shadow structure, transferred the controlling interest to a legitimate development group you'd had waiting for 2 years, and you walked away clean with enough money to fund a small country. Han Seok-rim had been building this for the better part of 2 years, using Minjae's name, Minjae's organization, Minjae's reach, so that when it finally came apart, if it came apart, the person holding the bag had a face that was already known to law enforcement, already associated with organized crime, already perfectly cast for the role of villain in the story Han was writing. She sat with this for a long time. Then she called a number she had memorized and never written down. It rang 4 times. "I've seen the file," she said. Minjae's voice was even. "And?" "Han's not just running a side operation. He's been building an exit." She said it flat, no ornamentation. "He's going to let this collapse onto you. He has been building it to collapse onto you for 2 years. The properties, the loans, the collectors, all of it roots back to structures that carry your operational signatures. When law enforcement comes in, and they will come in, everything they find is going to look like yours. Silence on the line. He's planned the exit, she said, which means there's a timeline. Something that triggers the end of the build phase and the start of the collapse phase. I don't know what it is yet. I do, Min-jae said. His voice had changed, still quiet, but the quality of the quiet was different. There is a rezoning petition before the City Planning Commission, he said. It was filed 3 weeks ago. The hearing is in 11 days. 11 days. She was out of the coffee shop and on the street before she'd consciously decided to stand up, and the November air hit her like an interruption, sharp and cold and real. 11 days. Han had an 11-day runway before the entire structure went operational and Min-jae's name got buried in the wreckage. Except Min-jae knew now, which meant Han would find out Min-jae knew, which meant the timeline was going to accelerate, which meant the comfortable, methodical legal case she'd been constructing in her head, the careful, legitimate, through the proper channels approach she'd told Min-jae she was going to take, was already becoming a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford. She stood on the sidewalk on Michigan Avenue with people moving around her in every direction, and she thought about 31 businesses. She thought about the 2 that had closed permanently. She thought about a 73-year-old man with arthritic hands whose signature had been forged on a loan document he'd never agreed to. She thought about Marcus asking her if they should be scared. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Static at first. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Different from the man outside her door last night, younger, rougher, speaking quickly. Ms. Brooks, my name doesn't matter. I used to work, inside the organization. I need you to know something. Han Seok-rim knows about the drive that was delivered to you this morning. Her grip tightened on the phone. He knows Min-jae gave it to you, the voice continued, and he's moved the timeline up. He's calling a meeting of the captains tonight. He's going to tell them Min-jae is compromised, that Min-jae is working with outside sources to... Ms. Brooks, if the captains believe him, Min-jae won't make it through the week, and you... A pause. Something that might have been breath or might have been wind. He's already sent people to find you. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Around her, Michigan Avenue continued being Michigan Avenue, cabs and pedestrians and a bus pulling to the curb, and 2 tourists arguing over a map, and a delivery guy on a bike cutting across the lane without looking. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be on a cold November morning in Chicago. She thought, I told him no last night. She thought, I meant it. She stood on the sidewalk and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd learned when she was 19 and furious at things she couldn't control. And she waited until the breathing steadied everything inside her that had started to shake. And then she called Min-jae back. Where are your captains meeting tonight? She said when he picked up. A pause. A long one, by his standards. Why? Because Han's already told them you're compromised. Because by the time you walk into that meeting, the story will be set and you'll be defending yourself against a narrative that's had 12 hours to take root. She was already walking, no direction in particular, just moving because standing still felt wrong. And because whoever just called me from an unknown number to warn me has also given Han exactly what he needs to prove his point. What do you mean? He told me Han knows about the drive, which means someone inside your organization is feeding information in 2 directions, to you and to Han. The call I just received was designed to make me call you, and now that I've called you, Han knows we're in contact. She stopped walking. He's orchestrating this. The warning wasn't for my benefit. It was a mechanism. Complete silence on the line. Then, very quietly, the meeting is at 9 tonight. River North Warehouse, 12 captains. I need to be there. Absolutely not. Not. Min-jae. She said his name the way she said names in courtrooms when she needed someone to understand she was done offering options. Han is going to walk into that room tonight with a story that ends with you. The only variable he has not planned for in any version of this is me. Because I'm not supposed to exist in any version of this. I'm the thing that doesn't fit the narrative he's been building for 2 years. She paused. Let me not fit it in person. The silence stretched. She counted to 7 before he spoke. If you walk into that warehouse, he said, Han will know within an hour. And if Han knows you're there, he will not wait for a narrative. He will make a decision. I know. You understand what that means. I understand that 31 families have been losing their businesses for 22 months, she said, and that you're the only one who can walk into that room and be listened to, and that if you go in there without something Han can't counter, you're already finished. Her voice was level. She was surprised by how level it was. I'm something Han can't counter. Let me be that. She heard him breathe, one breath, slow. 9 o'clock, he said. I'll send an address. She hung up. She stood on Michigan Avenue in the November cold and looked up at the gray sky for a moment, at the lake wind bending the tops of the trees along the boulevard, and she thought about the last time she'd made a decision this fast and been this certain it was the right one. She was 12 years old, a bigger kid, a bicycle. She'd gotten a black eye. She'd given one back. Some things, it turned out, never changed at all. And at 9 o'clock tonight, inside a warehouse in River North, with 12 men who didn't know her name sitting in judgment of a man she didn't fully trust, Nia Brooks was going to walk through a door that she could not come back through. She got to the warehouse at 8:43, not because she was early by habit, but because she'd sat in her car 2 blocks away for 11 minutes, trying to talk herself out of it one final time, and when she couldn't, she figured she might as well go in. The building was on a dead-end street backing up to the river, the kind of industrial block that Chicago had dozens of. Too far from the tourist corridors to be converted into condos yet, too close to the water to be ignored forever. A loading dock on the east side. 3 vehicles parked outside, black, expensive, the same breed as the ones from the night before. 2 men at the entrance who looked at her the way men at entrances looked at things that weren't supposed to be there. She didn't slow down. Min-jae is expecting me, she said. One of them put a hand out, not touching her, just blocking. He said something in Korean and she waited while the other one pulled out a phone and made a call that lasted about 15 seconds. And then the hand came down and the door opened and she went in. The interior was large and underlit, the kind of space where the ceiling disappeared into shadow above the reach of the work lights set up along the floor. It smelled like machine oil and river damp and, faintly, cigarette smoke. Folding tables had been set up in a rough rectangle in the center of the space, with chairs around them and men in those chairs who all stopped talking when she walked in. 12 men. She counted without appearing to count, ranging from maybe 35 to maybe 60, dressed in the particular way of men who had money but weren't performing it tonight. Practical clothing, watchful eyes, the kind of collective stillness that a room full of dangerous people achieved when something unexpected entered their space. Min-jae was at the far end of the table. He looked at her when she came in, and his face did not change, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was what she saw in the fraction of a second before his expression locked down, something that might have been relief, or might have been the particular look of a man who'd been standing on a ledge and had just been handed something to hold on to. Then she saw Han Seok-rim. He was seated to Min-jae's left, 3 chairs down, and he was the only person in the room who was smiling when she entered. Not the way Min-jae smiled, that quiet, internalized thing. Han's smile was fast and sharp and gone almost before it arrived, like a camera flash. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 37, trim, with a stillness that was different from Min-jae's. Where Min-jae's stillness felt like something controlled, Han's felt like something coiled. He looked at her the way a chess player looks at a piece that's just moved onto the board, like he'd been waiting for it. That was when the first thing she hadn't planned for made itself known in the base of her spine, a cold and specific wrongness. But she was already in the room and already walking toward the empty chair Min-jae had indicated, and there was nothing behind her but a closed door and 2 men outside it. She sat down. Min-jae spoke first, in English, which she understood was for her benefit, and also a signal to the room that this was the language of the meeting now, which some of them received with visible discomfort. I asked Ms. Brooks here tonight because she has documentation relevant to what we're discussing. She's an attorney. She's been reviewing materials connected to the property acquisition operation. Han said something in Korean, quiet, flat. Min-jae responded, also in Korean, and the exchange lasted about 20 seconds and had the quality of 2 people who had been having a longer argument through shorter sentences. Then Min-jae said, in English, Han would prefer we conduct this in Korean. I've explained that would be discourteous to our guest. I'm not a guest, Nia said. I'm a witness. There's a difference. Some of the men around the table shifted, not dramatically, just the small postural adjustments of people recalibrating what kind of evening this was going to be. Han looked at her. A witness to what exactly? His English was excellent, cleaner than Minji's, with less of a deliberate quality to it, the kind of fluency that came from years of use rather than study. To a fraud operation that's been running for 22 months, she said. 31 businesses in 2 neighborhoods, targeted through forged loan documentation and coordinated intimidation. The whole structure routes through holding companies that carry operational signatures belonging to this organization. She looked at the men around the table rather than at Han. Your names aren't on the paperwork, but the infrastructure is yours, which means when law enforcement follows the trail, and the trail is clear enough that a second-year associate could follow it, they're going to come to you first and ask questions second. Silence. Heavy and attentive. Han let it sit for a moment before he spoke. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. And you have documentation. I have documentation. May I ask where this documentation came from? Han's voice was conversational, almost warm, like a professor asking a student to walk through their methodology. Because the materials that would contain this kind of operational detail would have to come from inside this organization, which would mean someone gave it to you. He paused. Which would mean you have a source. She understood what he was doing. She'd watched prosecutors do the same thing, turn the evidence into a question about the witness, make the room look at the messenger rather than the message. The documentation came from Min Jae, she said. Directly. Han nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something. And when did you first meet Min Jae? He asked. Last night. Last night. He repeated it without emphasis, which was itself a form of emphasis. He looked around the table. So Min Jae shared internal organizational materials with a woman he met last night. He looked back at Nia. During which time 4 of our men were incapacitated by this same woman in the back of a grocery store. Another pause. And then Min Jae went to her apartment at 2 in the morning. The room had changed temperature. She could feel it. The question I'd be asking, Han said, still in that same level, almost reasonable voice, is not what the documentation shows. The question I'd be asking is why Minji is so eager to share it with someone he met less than 24 hours ago, and what he's trying to divert attention from by doing so. One of the older men at the table, heavy-set, a scar along his jaw, the kind of face that had stopped reacting to rooms like this long ago, said something in Korean, short, interrogative. Min Jae answered. The exchange went back and forth 3 times, and then Han inserted himself into it, and Nia sat there, unable to follow the language and very aware of that, watching faces instead of listening to words, reading the room the way she read juries. Not for what they were saying, but for what was happening underneath the saying. What was happening was that Han was winning, not dramatically, not obviously, the way a current wins, gradually, without announcing itself. And you realize you've been pulled off course only when you look up and the shore is somewhere you don't recognize. She looked at Min Jae. He was arguing, but the set of his jaw had the quality of a man who was already calculating a retreat rather than advancing. The older man with the scar wasn't looking at Min Jae anymore. He was looking at the table in front of him with the particular expression of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting for the room to catch up to it. Then Han reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and set a photograph on the table. He slid it toward the center, unhurried, the way you set a card down in a game you know you've already won. It was a photograph of Nia and Min Jae. In the SUV. Outside her building. Taken through the windshield from a distance, but clear. The 2 of them visible in the front cabin, close, the ambient light catching both their faces. Taken at 2:20 this morning, Han said, 14 minutes after she led his men into her building. He laid a second photograph beside the first. The coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. Through the window. Her with the laptop, the drive she hadn't thought about while sitting there, plugged visibly into the side. 10:57 this morning. A third photograph. Her on the sidewalk, phone to her ear. 11:41, approximately 3 minutes after she received materials from our internal drive. She made a call. We know who she called. He folded his hands on the table. Min-jae has been sharing internal materials, financial records, and operational intelligence with an outside attorney, Han said. Someone who has an active legal practice. Someone who has, in the past, used information about our operations to win civil cases that damaged our property holdings. He looked at her. I'm not accusing you of anything, Ms. Brooks. I'm simply pointing out that from where I'm sitting, from where any of these men are sitting, what this looks like is a coordinated effort to gather evidence against this organization, and that Min-jae has been helping you do it. The older man with the scar said something. Another man, younger, across the table, responded. Han answered both of them without taking his eyes off Nia. She looked at Min-jae. He was looking at the photographs. His expression was not what she expected. She'd expected anger, at Han, at the situation, at the fact that they'd been under surveillance without knowing it. Instead, his face had the quality of someone who had looked into a room and found exactly the thing they'd feared finding, and was now doing the very slow, very deliberate internal work of not showing what that cost them. Min-jae, she said. He looked at her. She said it quietly enough that only he could hear it. Tell me you didn't know those photographs existed. His eyes held hers for a moment. And there it was. Not guilt exactly. Not the look of a man who had done something wrong. The look of a man who had made a calculation that hadn't held, and who was now sitting with the weight of what that miscalculation had cost someone else. I knew we were likely being observed, he said. I did not know he had this level of documentation. The cold thing in her spine spread upward. You knew we were being observed, she said. I suspected you brought me here knowing I was being watched. Her voice was completely level. She was proud of that, in a distant way, the way you could be proud of technical execution even when everything else was falling apart. You gave me that drive knowing the exchange was being photographed. You called me to that car knowing... She stopped, breathed. You used me as a countermove. You put me on the board so Han would have to respond to me, and you didn't tell me that's what you were doing. He didn't deny it. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for. She'd prepared for him to explain it, to justify it, to give her the strategic logic in a way that she could argue with. Instead, he just sat there and took it, and the absence of a defense was somehow worse than any defense he could have offered. Han was watching this exchange with an expression of careful neutrality that was its own kind of satisfaction. The documentation I showed these men tonight, Nia said, pulling herself back to the room, to the task, because falling apart was something she could do later in a parking lot where nobody could see it, is real. The fraud is real. 31 businesses, 22 months. The end target is a rezoning play that will destroy 2 neighborhoods and walk away with an 8-figure profit for whoever controls the shell structure. She looked at the men around the table. Ask yourselves who benefits from the rezoning petition. Ask yourselves whose name is on the holding company at the top of the chain. Because I have that information, and I am happy to share it in a room that contains fewer. The holding company, Han said pleasantly, is registered to an investment group in which I hold no equity. It's managed by a retired property developer named Whitfield, who's been acquiring distressed commercial real estate in those neighborhoods for 3 years through entirely legitimate channels. He spread his hands on the table. Ms. Brooks, I've heard this theory. The idea that I've been running a shadow operation using organizational infrastructure. It's a very elegant theory. It has one significant problem. He opened a folder that had been sitting on the table in front of him since she'd arrived, and she realized with a slow, cold clarity that it had been sitting there the whole time. He'd come into this room prepared for her. He'd known she would be here before she'd decided to come. He laid documents on the table. Multiple pages, organized, already prepared for distribution. He slid copies toward 3 of the captains nearest him. The fraud documentation Min-jae gave Ms. Brooks traces back through a set of holding companies, Han said. What she didn't have, what she couldn't have had, because it only came into existence 6 months ago, is a second layer, below the operational layer. The layer that shows who originally capitalized the shell structures and who has been drawing fees from the extortion payments. He tapped the documents. That layer leads to a company called 7 Rivers Development, and 7 Rivers Development has one beneficial owner. He looked at Min-jae. Your name has been on that structure for 4 years, Han said. Long before I had any awareness of what that structure was being used for. The room went completely, absolutely still. Nia looked at the documents. She looked at Min-jae. His face had become very careful. Not blank. Min-jae didn't do blank. It wasn't in his register, but controlled in the way of a man applying deliberate force to keep something contained. That company, Minjae said, was dissolved 3 years ago. The dissolution filing exists, Han agreed, along with a reinstatement filing dated 7 months later, signed by a proxy who can be connected, with some effort, back to your office. He sat back. I'm not saying you knew what the structure was being used for when it was reinstated. I'm saying your name is on it. And when investigators start pulling on this thread, which they will, because Ms. Brooks here has apparently been seeding information to outside sources, your name is what they're going to find. One of the captains stood up. Not the one with the scar. Younger, maybe 40, the kind of man who'd been containing a decision since Nia walked in and had finally resolved it. He said something in Korean, and whatever it was, 2 other men around the table responded with what sounded like agreement. Han listened and nodded once. Nia said, Minjae. She said it the way she said names in courtrooms when someone was about to make the worst decision of their lives, and she needed them to hear her through the noise of their own panic. The reinstatement filing, did you sign it or authorize it? He looked at her. No. Then someone did it for you. Someone had access to your office, your documents, your proxy authorization. She looked at Han. Someone who had been your second in command for 9 years. That's a theory, Han said. So is yours. Mine has a document. Documents can be created. She looked at the captains who were still seated, the ones who hadn't stood yet, the ones who were still listening. A man who's been building a fraudulent property acquisition empire for 22 months is absolutely capable of generating a document backdated 7 months. That is a significantly simpler thing to do than what he's already done. She leaned forward. Ask yourselves why Han had this folder ready. Ask yourselves why he had those photographs ready. Ask yourselves why every piece of evidence he's presenting tonight existed before this meeting was called. She looked around the table. He knew this meeting was going to happen. He called it. He set the agenda. He prepared the evidence. She paused. The only thing he didn't prepare for was me, because he didn't know I'd be here until 3 hours ago. Silence. The man who'd stood was still standing. He hadn't sat back down, but he hadn't moved toward the door either. That was something. Not much, but something. Han looked at her with an expression that was almost admiring, in the way of a man who respected technical skill even when it was being used against him. You're good, he said. I want to say that sincerely. Really, you're very good. He picked up his phone from the table. He did it casually, the way you pick up a phone when you're expecting a call. But good doesn't change what's on those documents. And good doesn't change the fact that law enforcement has, as of about 40 minutes ago, received an anonymous submission containing the materials from the drive that was shared with you this morning, along with correspondence indicating that you and Minjae coordinated the sharing of those materials, along with the photographs. He set the phone back down. Law enforcement is going to open this tonight. By morning, they're going to be asking questions, and the story they're going to find... He stopped. Well, you've seen the documents. The standing man sat back down, not in relief, in decision. He said something to Minjae in Korean, flat and final, and 3 other men at the table responded in what sounded like agreement. The old man with the scar, who had not said a word in the last 20 minutes, pushed his copy of Han's documents to the center of the table without looking at anyone. That was the moment. Nia had spent 11 years in courtrooms, and she knew the moment when a verdict shifted, not when it was announced. Before, the specific atmospheric change in a room when a collective decision has been reached, and everyone can feel it, and nobody has said it yet. The room had decided. She looked at Minjae. He was looking at Han, and Han was looking at his phone again, at something on the screen, and his face had gone completely neutral in the way that faces went neutral when they were receiving confirmation of something they'd already been certain of. There's one more thing, Han said. He said it almost gently, like a doctor delivering the part of the diagnosis they'd saved for last. He set the phone face up on the table and slid it toward the center so the men nearest could see the screen. Taken 40 minutes ago. Nia looked at the screen from across the table. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. Then she understood. It was a photograph of the front of Reeves' grocery. The lights were on inside, and standing in the lit doorway, visible through the window, was a small figure in a winter jacket. Marcus. She was on her feet before she'd processed standing up. He's fine, Han said. At the moment. Her voice came out very quiet. If you touch that child, I have no interest in touching children, Ms. Brooks. I'm not a violent man. Han picked up his phone and locked the screen. But I am a practical one. And practically speaking, the situation as it currently exists is that you and Min Jae have, between you, created a significant problem for this organization. Law enforcement has materials that could implicate 12 men in this room. And the person whose name is on the beneficial ownership structure of the shell company is sitting at this table. He looked at Min Jae. The practical resolution, from where I'm sitting, is that Min Jae takes responsibility for what the documents show, steps back from his current position, and allows this organization to move forward in a way that distances it from the investigation. He looked at Nia. And Ms. Brooks takes her car and goes home and does not ever discuss what she's seen in this room or in those documents with anyone, at all. The room waited. The river sounds came through the walls, low and continuous. Nia stood at the table with her hands flat on its surface, and she looked at Han, and she thought with extraordinary clarity, he planned every step of tonight. The anonymous submission to law enforcement. That happened before this meeting, before she called Minji back, before she agreed to come. Which meant the moment she'd gotten into that SUV on Michigan Avenue and decided to trust her instinct that she was the one variable Han hadn't planned for. That was the moment she'd been most wrong. Because he'd planned for her. He'd planned for exactly the version of herself she'd brought into this room. The attorney, the argument, the evidence. He'd planned a counter to all of it. What he hadn't planned for was whatever she did next. And she had no idea what that was. Min Jae said, from his end of the table, with a quietness so total it carried to every corner of the room, "Where is the boy?" Han looked at him. "Safe." "Where?" "That depends on what you decide in the next few minutes." Min Jae was very still. Then he put both palms on the table and stood up slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who had decided something and was making sure the room understood that the decision had been made and was not going to be revisited. He looked at Nia. In his eyes was something she hadn't seen there before, not fear, not calculation, not the careful management of information, something rawer than all of those things. The look of a man who had been playing a long game for a long time and had just watched it taken apart at its foundation, and who was standing in the ruins of it trying to find the thing that still mattered. "Tell me where the child is," he said to Han, "and I will do what you're asking." Nia said, "No." Her voice came out as flat and certain as anything she'd ever said. "Min Jae? No." "Ms. Brooks, if he surrenders, the boy doesn't come home," she said, "because the boy is the only leverage Han has left once this is done. He knows that, and I know that, and you know that." She looked at Han. "You don't get what you want by releasing what you're using to get it. That's not how this works." Han smiled, the camera flash smile, there and gone. "You're a very smart woman," he said, "and that is unfortunately the problem." He picked up his phone and made a call. 3 seconds. One word in Korean. The door behind Nia opened. She turned. 4 men came in. Not the guards from outside. Different men, bigger, with the particular blank efficiency of people whose job was a specific task, and who had no emotional relationship with that task in either direction. She looked at the 4 of them. She looked at the table of 12 captains, some of whom were watching and some of whom had looked away. And the ones who had looked away were the ones who had already told her everything she needed to know about what happened next. She looked at Min Jae. I was looking at her and she read it clearly for the first time. He was trying to tell her something without words, with just his eyes, in a room full of people who were watching his face, and what he was trying to tell her was, one of the men grabbed her arm, and every carefully constructed version of the night, the legal strategy, the documented evidence, the argument she'd walked in here prepared to make, every single bit of it dissolved, and what was left was the version of herself she kept very specifically separate from the version that stood in courtrooms. The version that was 12 years old and watching someone take a bicycle. She drove her elbow back into the man's solar plexus with enough force that she felt it in her shoulder, pivoted before he'd finished doubling over, and was already moving when the second one came in from the left, and the warehouse, the 12 captains, Han's prepared folder, the photographs, the documents, the entire elaborate architecture of the trap she'd walked into. The first man went down before he understood what had happened to him. That was the thing about elbow strikes at close range. They didn't announce themselves the way punches did. There was no wind-up, no telegraphing, just the sudden blunt fact of dense bone connecting with soft tissue, and then the man was bent at the waist, making a sound like a deflating tire, and Nia was already pivoting on her left foot toward the second one. He was smarter. He'd seen the first one go down, and he'd backed up half a step, which gave him distance, which gave her less to work with. He came in low and wide, trying to wrap her up rather than strike, which told her he'd been trained to restrain rather than fight, which also told her that whoever Han had sent to collect her tonight had not been told exactly what she was. That was a mistake on Han's part. She let him get close, closer than felt right, close enough that she could smell the cigarettes on his jacket. And then she dropped her weight and let his arms close on air and came up inside his reach with a palm strike to the chin that snapped his head back and buckled his knees. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. The third man had a weapon out. She saw it in her peripheral vision. Not a gun, a collapsible baton, already extended, which meant he'd had it ready before he came through the door. He swung it in a controlled arc toward her left side, and she took it on her forearm because the alternative was her ribs, and her forearm could absorb it without putting her down. It still hurt like hell. The impact ran up to her shoulder, and her left arm went partly numb, and she used the momentum of the swing to turn into him rather than away, got inside the arc before he could recover it, and put him against the wall with enough force that the sheet metal rang. The fourth man didn't come at her. He stepped back and pulled a gun. Everything stopped. Not the room. The room kept breathing, kept existing, 12 captains and Han and Min-jae all still there, all still watching. But the particular physics of the confrontation stopped, the way confrontations did when a gun appeared, because a gun was the thing that rewrote every equation in the room simultaneously. Nia stood with her back to the wall, and her left arm still half numb, and blood starting in a thin line from where the baton had caught her forearm skin, and she looked at the gun and did the calculation that people did in that specific moment. The calculation that was mostly instinct dressed up in the language of logic. She was 8 feet away. The man holding it was not shaking. His grip was two-handed, slightly high, the stance of someone who had learned from instruction rather than from necessity, which meant there was a gap between his technical skill and his real-world hesitation. People who had shot someone before held a gun differently. It settled into them. This one was still performing the holding of it. "That's enough," Han's voice, from across the table. Flat, authoritative. The man with the gun did not lower it, but he stopped advancing. Nia's arm was starting to come back, pins and needles working up from her wrist. She breathed through it, in through the nose. She became aware, peripherally, that the 3 men she'd put down were all still down. Not unconscious, but in the specific stage of pain where standing up was a project you needed to gather yourself for. She looked at Han. He was standing now, at his end of the table, and the folder was still in front of him, and the 12 captains were in various states of stillness, and the whole room had the quality of a photograph taken one frame before something shattered. "This is not the outcome I wanted tonight," Han said. He sounded like he meant it. "Ms. Brooks, sit down." "No. Sit down. You have a child somewhere in this city, and you used his location as a bargaining chip in a room full of men who were already going to do whatever you told them to do tonight," she said. Her voice was steady, and she was glad of that, because the rest of her was not entirely steady. Her forearm was broadcasting pain in steady, rhythmic waves, and her heart was doing something loud and urgent in her chest that she was actively not paying attention to. "You don't need the boy to get what you want. You already have it. So tell me where he is." Han studied her for a long moment. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm aware. Sit down and I'll tell you the boy is safe." "Tell me where he is and I'll consider sitting down," Min-jae said, from his position at the table, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled. Han looked at him. "Tell her where the boy is." The room was very still. Han and Min-jae looked at each other across the length of the table, and it was a different kind of confrontation than what had just happened. Not physical, not even primarily verbal. 9 years of proximity compressed into a look. The entire history of 2 men who had built something together and had, at some point that neither of them could probably identify precisely, started building different things and calling it the same name. Han said something in Korean. Min-jae answered in Korean. It went back and forth twice, and then Han said, in English, to Nia, "The boy is at the Reeves grocery store. He was never taken anywhere. A photograph was taken through the window from outside. He's been there all evening." She absorbed this. "You bluffed," she said. "I didn't need the reality," he said. "I only needed the image." He sat back down. "The boy is fine. He's been fine. His grandfather is with him. They're probably watching television in the back room." The gun was still up. The man holding it looked at Han, waiting. Han made a small gesture with 2 fingers. The gun came down. Nia stood at the wall with blood running down the back of her forearm in a thin track, and she thought, he bluffed. He didn't take the boy. He showed her a photograph and let her construct the threat herself, because she was the one who'd made the boy matter by protecting him the night before. And Han had known she would, because Han had known who she was for 14 months. He'd been building this for 14 months, and he'd factored her in as a piece. She looked around the room, the captains, the documents on the table, the 3 men she'd put down, one of whom was finally starting to get to his feet, moving slowly, keeping a careful distance. She thought about what she actually had, not what she wished she had, not what she'd had 2 hours ago before Han's folder appeared on the table, what she actually had right now in this room. She had the documentation on the drive. Han had already submitted that to law enforcement, which was a problem, but it also meant the investigation was now open and the materials were in an evidentiary chain that couldn't be easily recalled. She had the forged signature on Mr. Reeves' loan agreement, which she'd photographed that morning. She had Han's documents, his folder, the copies he'd distributed to the captains, which made specific claims about a corporate structure that she now needed to pick apart. She had the fact that Han had prepared this meeting in advance, which meant he'd known it was coming, which meant someone had told him. The double-channel source. The person feeding information in both directions. She looked at Min Jae. He was looking at her with that same careful, contained expression, and she did what she'd been doing since she walked into this room. She read past the expression to the thing underneath it. The thing he was trying to communicate through a room full of people where speaking directly was a trap. He knew who the double-channel source was. She could see it. He'd known since before tonight, maybe since before the coffee shop, and he hadn't told her, and she was about to be very angry about that, except that being angry about it right now was a luxury she'd have to defer. "The 7 Rivers document," she said to Han, "the one with Min Jae's name on the beneficial ownership structure." She walked back to the table, not to her chair. She walked to where the captain had left his copy of Han's documents, and she picked it up. The man looked at her but didn't object. "The reinstatement filing, you said it's signed by a proxy who can be connected back to Min Jae's office." "Correct." "What's the proxy's name?" Han looked at her. He hadn't expected the question. Not the question itself, the direction of it. He'd expected her to argue the document's validity. He hadn't expected her to ask who signed it. "The name on the proxy authorization is Daniel Cho," Han said, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell her he'd decided whether to answer and chosen yes. "He's worked in Min Jae's office for 3 years as an administrative coordinator." She set the document down. She looked at Min Jae. "Do you employ someone named Daniel Cho?" A beat. "I did," Min Jae said. "He left the organization 7 months ago." "Under what circumstances?" Another beat, longer. "He was let go. There were concerns about unauthorized access to organizational records." Han's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, a very small, very fast recalibration. "When exactly was he let go?" Nia said. "February," Min Jae said. "Late February." She looked down at the reinstatement filing, found the date, February 11th. She looked at the termination and she felt the thing click into place, the way things clicked in when you'd been working a problem long enough and the right angle finally presented itself. "Daniel Cho signed this document on February 11th, she said. "You terminated him in late February for unauthorized records access." She looked around the table, which means the man who signed this document, the man whose signature is being used to connect this corporate structure back to Min Jae, was terminated from the organization after signing it, for accessing records he shouldn't have had access to. She set the paper down. Or he was terminated because someone wanted a clean break between him and the organization before this document became relevant. The room was processing this. Han said, "The timing is circumstantial." Most things are circumstantial until they aren't, she said. Where is Daniel Cho now? Silence. She looked at Han. You know where he is. Han's jaw tightened, fractionally. She almost missed it. I have no relationship with Daniel Cho. That's not what I asked. Ms. Brooks, you set up a proxy authorization and used it to connect this corporate structure to Min Jae, and then you made sure the proxy was gone before you needed the document to exist. She kept her voice level. Daniel Cho is either somewhere you can control him or somewhere he can't contradict your version of events. Which is it? Han stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the kind of movement that was itself a statement. He straightened his jacket. He gathered his folder. He spoke in Korean to the men around the table, and it was a longer statement than anything he'd said since the beginning of the meeting, and she couldn't follow it, but she watched faces, and what she saw on faces was uncertainty. Not the decided faces from earlier, not the captain who had stood up and sat back down in resolution. Something had shifted by a degree or two, and a degree or two was enough. One of the older captains, not the one with the scar, a different one, to Min Jae's right, said something. Han answered. The captain responded with what sounded like a question, and Han's answer to the question was shorter and tighter than it should have been, and the captain pushed back, and his face did a thing. Just for a second. Just in the gap between Han's prepared answer and the question he hadn't been prepared for. His face did a thing that Nia had learned to watch for in 11 years of working with people under pressure. The specific micro-expression of a man who knows the room is no longer entirely with him and is deciding in real time whether to push harder or to change strategy. He changed strategy. We'll table the discussion of the documentation, Han said in English, which brought the conversation back to a place she could follow. The immediate concern is the law enforcement situation. By morning, investigators are going to have materials. The organization needs to present a unified front and determine how to manage the exposure. He looked at Min Jae. I'm proposing a transitional structure, a temporary leadership arrangement while this is resolved. Nothing permanent. Nothing permanent, Min Jae said. Temporary. And who leads this temporary arrangement? Han said nothing. He didn't need to. The captain with the scar, who had been silent for most of the meeting and whose silence Nia had been trying to read for the better part of an hour, spoke for the first time in Korean. It was a single sentence. Han answered. The captain shook his head once, slowly, with the finality of a man declining something for the last time, and said something else. Han's jaw tightened again. This time it didn't release as fast. Min Jae said, quietly, in English, Captain Yoon is asking who authorized the use of organizational resources for a private property acquisition scheme. He's been asking it since before Ms. Brooks arrived. You haven't answered him. Han looked at Min Jae. The discussion of answer him, Min Jae said. The room was very still. Outside, the river, the city, November rain that hadn't stopped. Inside, 12 men and the specific silence of a room waiting for a lie or a truth and not yet sure which one it was going to get. Han said, in Korean, something short and final sounding. Captain Yoon responded. And then, before Han could answer, one of the men who had come in with Han, not the four who'd come in after Nia, a different one who'd been standing near the door since the beginning, said something. One sentence, direct at Han. Han went very still. Whatever the man had said, it had cost him something to say it. I was young, maybe 30, and his face had the specific quality of someone who had been holding something for a long time and had chosen, in this moment, for reasons Nia could not know, to put it down. Han said, in Korean, something quiet. The young man shook his head. Min Jae looked at Nia. He said very quietly, in English that he shaped for her alone. He just told them he handled the Daniel Cho authorization himself. On Han's order, he signed Min Jae's name to the proxy document. The room fell apart slowly, the way things fell apart when the thing holding them together turned out to be something that could speak. 3 captains were talking simultaneously. Captain Yoon was on his feet. Han was very still at his end of the table in the way of a man doing rapid calculations and not liking any of the results. The young man, the one who'd spoken, Han's own man, was looking at the floor. Han said something sharp and short in Korean. The young man didn't look up. Han said it again. Nia watched Han's right hand move toward the inside of his jacket, and she was moving before she'd consciously processed what she'd seen, coming around the corner of the table, covering the distance in 3 steps. And she got her hand on Han's wrist at the same moment he got his hand on the weapon inside his jacket, and they were very close together and very still, and she could feel the tendons in his wrist working against her grip, and her forearm was screaming from the baton shot, and she held on. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. This close, she could see things in his face that the length of a table had hidden. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining something enormous for a long time and is now watching it come undone all at once. And underneath that, something she hadn't expected. Not fury, fear. "Don't," she said again. Quieter. His wrist stopped moving against her grip. The room had gone absolutely silent. Every man in it was looking at the two of them. Min-jae said, "Han." Just the name. Nothing else. Han looked at Min-jae over Nia's shoulder. Whatever passed between them in that look had no language. It was 9 years of something that had started as loyalty and had curdled into ambition and then into something that was neither. And it was not a thing she could read fully because she was outside it. She was always going to be outside it. Han's hand came away from the weapon. She stepped back. Her forearm was shaking. She controlled it. She pressed it against her side and controlled it. Han straightened his jacket again. He looked around the room at 12 men, most of whom were no longer looking at him the way they had been at the beginning of the meeting, and he did the calculation. She could see him doing it the same way she saw witnesses do it on the stand when they realized the story they'd come in with wasn't the story the room was going to accept. "I want a lawyer," Han said. The room blinked. Captain Yoon said something in Korean that Nia suspected, from his tone, was not complimentary. "I want a lawyer present before I say anything else," Han said. He said it in English, to Nia specifically, with a kind of dark, exhausted irony that she almost would have respected under different circumstances. "I assume you can recommend someone competent." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm a little busy right now," she said. The young man who had spoken, Han's man, the one who had put the proxy authorization down in the open, was still looking at the floor. He would not look up for a long time. She understood that. When you broke something that had been your whole world, even if it needed breaking, you needed a minute before you could look at what the breaking had made. Min-jae crossed the room to where she was standing. He stopped beside her and they both looked at Han and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Min-jae said quietly, not to her, "I built this for 20 years. He was looking at Han. "Every rule I set was because I knew what happened when there were no rules. I watched it happen before I had the power to stop it, and I decided when I had the power, I would stop it." A pause. "You knew that. You were there for 9 years. You knew why the rules existed." Han looked at him. "The rules existed so you could feel better about what you were." "Yes," Min-jae said, "just that. No argument, no defense. And they also meant that 31 families weren't being robbed by my organization, which you changed." Han said nothing. "Where are the originals of the Cho authorization?" Min-jae said. Han's eyes moved, just slightly, involuntarily, toward the floor on his left side. She looked at the floor, at his briefcase, which was leaning against the table leg nearest his chair. She walked to it before Han could move, picked it up, set it on the table. "That is," Han started. "Evidence," she said, "in an active investigation." She looked at him steadily. "Feel free to argue that with the investigators when they arrive." She opened the briefcase. Inside were 3 folders, a second phone, a USB drive, and a small sealed envelope with a string closure that had the particular density of something that was not paper. She left the envelope. She opened the first folder. The Cho authorization originals were in the second folder, behind 3 other documents. She could see immediately what the copy had smoothed over. There were corrections on the original, small ones, places where language had been changed, and the changes showed in the ink. Handwritten notes in the margin in what she assumed was Korean. She photographed every page. She looked at the USB drive. She looked at Han. "What's on this?" she said. He didn't answer. 14 months of work, she said. "You've been running this for 22 months total, but you've been planning the exit for 14 months. The exit needs documentation, something that lets you walk away clean while everything collapses on someone else. That documentation has to live somewhere." She held up the drive. "Is this it?" Han's face was doing the thing again. the calculation, the strategy shift. He said, "Anything on that drive requires context to be interpreted correctly." "That's the most interesting thing you've said all night," she said, "because that's not a no." Min-jae beside her held out his hand. She looked at him. "The drive," he said. She looked at the drive in her hand, at Min-jae's open hand, at the room around them, 12 captains, some of whom were still trying to determine what exactly had happened in the last 40 minutes, some of whom had their phones out and were making calls in low voices, Captain Yoon, who was talking to two others in a cluster near the far wall. She put the drive in Min-jae's hand. He closed his fingers around it. "What are you going to do with that?" she said. "Something I should have done 14 months ago," he said. She didn't ask what. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. In the way that there were things about this situation she had consistently chosen not to know for the purpose of maintaining a position she could defend later, in a room, to people whose job it was to ask exactly these questions. She was a lawyer. She kept coming back to that. It kept feeling like an anchor, the kind you grabbed when the current was doing what it was doing. She was a lawyer, and she was standing in a warehouse in River North at 11 o'clock on a November night with blood drying on her forearm and a briefcase full of evidence that a man had spent 2 years carefully constructing. And the man who had built it was sitting at a folding table looking at his hands, and 12 men who ran one of the city's most organized criminal operations were in the process of some kind of collective reckoning that she had no formal role in and couldn't control. She could not control any of this. That thought arrived not as panic, but as clarity. Clear, cold, useful clarity. She could not control the captains or their decision. She could not control what Min-jae did with the drive. She could not control what Han had already sent to law enforcement or how investigators would interpret it in the morning. She could not undo the photographs or the documents already in the evidentiary chain. What she could control was the next 6 hours. She picked up her phone and started making calls. Not to Min-jae's people. Not to anyone in this room. She called a clerk she knew at the civil court who worked late. She called a forensic accountant she'd used twice on complex fraud cases, a man who charged too much and was worth every dollar because he could read corporate structure documents the way other people read novels. She called her own answering service and left herself a memo. Dates, times, names, every number from the fraudulent loan document she'd memorized that morning, because the memo would be time-stamped and the timestamp would matter. She was building the record that existed outside this room. While she called, she watched Han. He sat at the table and he did not try to leave and he did not speak. He had asked for a lawyer with the particular resignation of a man who understood that the architecture he'd spent 2 years building had just been entered from a direction he hadn't accounted for, and that the structure, while still standing, was no longer entirely his. She was on her third call when the door opened and 2 more of Min-jae's men came in, and the dynamic of the room shifted again. This time towards something more contained, more directed, the way a fire shifted when someone finally got the hoses on it. Still burning, but with a shape now. Captain Yoon approached her while she was finishing the call. He was maybe 60, with eyes that had been in rooms like this for a long time, and had developed a specific flat quality because of it. He said, in accented English that was careful and precise, "The documentation you described, the 31 businesses, you have all of it." "I have copies," she said. "The originals are on that drive." He looked at the drive in Min-jae's hand, across the room, then back at her. "The businesses. They can be made whole." "Some of them," she said. "The ones that are still open. The 2 that closed." She shook her head. "That's harder. But the fraudulent debt agreements can be dissolved. The payments that were made can potentially be recovered. It depends on how the corporate structure unwinds." He nodded slowly. "I was thinking about something." "The woman at the pharmacy," he said. "On Ashland. She's been paying $800 a month for 16 months. Nia looked at him. "You know her. She's my cousin's wife." He said it without expression. "She didn't know where else to go." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm going to need witnesses," she said. "People who can speak to the origination of the debt agreements, who approached them, when, what was said. People who are willing to do that on record." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll make some calls," he said. Across the room, Han stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, and everyone in the room tracked it. He stood up and he buttoned his jacket, one button, the way he might button it before leaving any room on any night, as if the act of ordinary grooming could impose some version of normalcy on what the last 2 hours had been. He looked at Minjae. Wherever this ends, he said, I built half of what you have. I know, Minjae said. That should count for something. It did, Minjae said. For 9 years it did. Han looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the young man who had spoken, who was still looking at the floor. Han's face did something Nia couldn't categorize. It wasn't anger, it wasn't betrayal, it was something older and more tired than either of those things. He looked at Nia last. You should have come here tonight, he said. You're probably right, she said. You've made this very complicated. That was the idea. He almost smiled, the camera flash thing, there and gone. Good luck with the case, Ms. Brooks. 2 of Minjae's men moved to stand on either side of him, and the 3 of them walked toward the door, and the room watched them go, and the door closed behind them, and the room exhaled. Her arm was throbbing from wrist to shoulder. She looked down at it. The skin was broken in a stripe along the outer forearm where the baton had caught it, and it had bled more than she'd registered in the moment, the fabric of her sleeve dark and stiff with it. She pressed her other hand over it and held pressure and breathed. Minjae was beside her. He looked at her arm. We need to get that looked at, he said. In a minute. She looked up at him. The drive. What are you going to do with it? Give it to someone who can use it legally, he said. That someone being someone outside this room, he said. He looked at her steadily. Someone whose involvement doesn't compromise the chain of evidence. Someone who has been building a case from the outside and needs a piece that connects the inside. She understood what he was saying. Me. You already have the copies from the briefcase, he said. The drive is the original. Originals matter. She looked at the drive in his hand. If I take that, she said, I have to account for how I got it. Chain of custody. Everything. You received it from me, he said, voluntarily, before law enforcement opened an investigation. That's a very thin... It's not thin, he said quietly. It's exactly what happened, in that order. He held it out to her. You were given materials before an investigation was opened. You are using those materials to support an ongoing legal matter on behalf of clients who have been defrauded. That is what lawyers do. She looked at the drive. She looked at his hand holding it. She thought about 31 families. She thought about a pharmacy on Ashland and a woman who had been paying $800 a month for 16 months because she didn't know where else to go. She took the drive. She put it in her coat pocket and pressed her hand flat against the pocket for a moment, feeling its weight. Then she put pressure back on her arm and looked around the room and said to Minjae, I need a first aid kit in about 20 minutes, and then I need to go talk to Mr. Reeves. He nodded. And then, she said, I need you to tell me who Daniel Cho is currently working for. Minjae was quiet for a moment. I think, he said carefully, that you already know the answer to that. She looked at him. She thought about the young man who had spoken tonight, Han's man, who had lowered his eyes to the floor and told the room the truth about the proxy authorization. She thought about why someone in Han's inner circle would make that choice tonight, in this room, at this moment. Not from conscience. People who worked for Han Seok Rim for any length of time had made their peace with the absence of conscience. From calculation. From the specific calculation of a man who saw which way the room was going and decided that the side of the room he was currently standing on was no longer the safe side. Which meant someone had told him before tonight that the room might go that way. Which meant the double-channel source, the person feeding information in both directions, had not been feeding information from Minjae's side to Han's side. It had been the other way around. The person feeding information was in Han's organization, feeding to Minjae. She looked at Minjae. You've had someone inside Han's operation, she said. It wasn't a question. For 8 months, he said quietly, since I first began to suspect what Han was building. And you didn't tell me. If I told you, and you had been taken tonight, Han would have questioned you. And if Han questioned you about what you knew, he stopped. I didn't tell you because you couldn't be put in the position of knowing it. She stood with that. She stood with the fact that he had protected her by withholding something, which was the same thing he'd done when he brought her into the SUV and given her the drive while knowing they were under surveillance. And the pattern of it was something she'd have to examine later, in better light, when her arm wasn't throbbing and she wasn't standing in a warehouse in River North with blood on her sleeve. We're going to have a conversation about the things you don't tell me, she said. Yes, he said. We are. Not tonight. Not tonight. She found the first aid kit in a room off the main floor. A small office, basically a closet with a desk. The kind of space every industrial building had that existed for paperwork and not much else. She sat on the edge of the desk and opened the kit and worked on her arm with the methodical focus of someone who had taped their own injuries often enough to have a system. The cut wasn't deep. It would bruise badly. The forearm muscle had taken the impact and would remind her of that for the next week, in the specific, nagging way of soft tissue injuries that weren't serious enough to immobilize you, but were serious enough to be present in everything you did. She wrapped it. She pulled her sleeve down over the wrap and stood up and went back out into the main space where the meeting had been. And most of the captains had dispersed, and the tables and chairs sat at their various angles like the aftermath of something, and the overhead work lights hummed, and the river pressed against the outside of the walls in the dark. Min-jae was at the far end of the room, on a phone call, speaking in Korean. Captain Yoon was near the door, also on a phone, also in Korean. Two other men she didn't know were going through the items from Han's briefcase systematically at one of the tables, photographing each page with a precision that told her they'd done something like this before. She walked to the window, a small high window near the loading dock, wire-reinforced glass, the kind designed to let light in and nothing else. Outside, the city. Chicago in November, wet and orange-lit and indifferent. She pressed the back of her wrapped arm against the cold of the window frame and let it sit there for a moment. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Again. She answered it. Ms. Brooks. The voice was different from the one that had called on Michigan Avenue. Older, slower. My name is Arthur Delacroix. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit. We received a submission tonight that appears to involve your name and a number of related materials. A pause. I'd like to set up a conversation. Tomorrow morning, if you're available. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. I'm available, she said, but I want it on record that I'm coming to you, not the other way around. And I'll be bringing documentation that was in my possession before the anonymous submission was made tonight. A pause on the other end. Understood. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock, she said. She hung up. Across the room, Min-jae had finished his call and was watching her. He raised his eyebrows slightly. The question. 8 o'clock tomorrow I talk to a financial crimes investigator, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'll have my lawyer available by 7:30. I don't need your lawyer. No, he agreed, but I would feel better. She looked at him for a long moment. At the warehouse around them, the aftermath, and the evidence, and the weight of a night that had started at 8:43 and was now approaching midnight, with most of what she'd planned gone sideways, and most of what had happened instead still being sorted through, and the peculiar, specific feeling of being in the middle of something that wasn't finished, that had a shape she could see the edges of, but not the end of. 31 businesses. 11 days before a rezoning hearing. A USB drive in her coat pocket. A financial crimes investigator at 8 o'clock in the morning. And Han Seok Rim, somewhere in this city, with a lawyer he hadn't called yet, and a version of events he hadn't finished constructing, and enough intelligence about how investigations worked to know that the first 12 hours mattered more than anything that came after. She needed to be faster than 12 hours. She picked up the briefcase. She picked up her coat. She looked at Min-jae. I'm going to Reeves' grocery, she said. I need to see that the boy is actually fine. And then I'm going to my office, and I'm going to be there until 8 o'clock in the morning. I'll have someone. No. She said it flat. No escort, no protection, no involvement. She looked at him steadily. I go to that meeting tomorrow as a lawyer with documentation she collected legally, not as someone who needed a crime syndicate to keep her safe on the way there. Do you understand the difference? He looked at her. Yes, he said. Good. She started toward the door. She was 3 steps from it when he said behind her quietly, Ms. Brooks. She stopped. Didn't turn. Whatever you're thinking about what happened tonight, with the surveillance, with what I did and didn't tell you. A pause. You're right to think it. I won't argue the point. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame and the November night on the other side of it, waiting. When I came to your building last night, he said, I told you that you were the only person outside my organization who had seen both sides of this. That was true. Another pause. What I didn't tell you was that I also came because I didn't know what else to do. and I haven't not known what to do in a very long time." She stood with that for a moment. She pushed the door open and went out into the wet and the dark and the city that went on being itself regardless, loud and cold and alive. And behind her the warehouse door swung shut and the river kept moving, and she walked to her car and got in and sat there for exactly 30 seconds before she started the engine. 8 o'clock in the morning. 11 days. She pulled out of the lot and headed south toward a grocery store where a 12-year-old boy who had never been taken anywhere was probably, as Han had said, watching television in the back room with his grandfather. And she was going to see that with her own eyes. And then she was going to go to her office and work through the night, because the night was what she had, and she was not going to waste it. The city moved around her car. The rain had finally stopped, sometime in the last hour without her noticing, and the streets were wet and reflective, and the stoplights bled long red and green lines across the pavement as she drove. She drove, and she thought, and she did not look in the rearview mirror because looking behind her right now was a thing she could not afford. And the only direction that mattered was forward, toward whatever waited at the end of 11 days and 8 o'clock in the morning and the thing that was still not finished. The drive in her coat pocket pressed against her side, small and dense, and full of the 2 years of Han Seok-rim's careful, meticulous, she got to Reeves' grocery at 12:17 in the morning. The lights were still on inside, the way Mr. Reeves always kept them on late, a habit from 40 years of late restocking that his body refused to give up even when his knees asked him to. She could see him through the window before she pushed the door open, sitting on his stool behind the counter with a cup of something, a small television on the shelf behind him, running a late news broadcast with the sound low. Marcus was at the end of the counter with a textbook open in front of him that he was not reading because he was watching the door, and when she came in, his shoulders dropped about 2 inches with a relief that he immediately tried to make look like something else. "You're bleeding," he said. "It stopped," she said. She looked at both of them, Marcus with his taped glasses and his textbook, Mr. Reeves with his cup and his tired eyes, and the particular dignity of a man who had been frightened badly and had not let it break his posture. She stood in the doorway of the store for a moment and just looked at them, which was something she needed to do, and couldn't have fully explained why. "Is it over?" Mr. Reeves asked. She thought about what over meant, about the drive in her pocket, and the 8 o'clock meeting, and the 11 days, and the rezoning hearing, and the 31 businesses, and the 2 that had already closed, and the forensic accountant she'd called, and the clerk, and the investigator named Delacroix, who had a careful voice and careful timing. "Not yet," she said, "but it's going in the right direction." He nodded once, slowly, like that was sufficient for now. Like sufficient for now was what he'd learned to accept after 73 years of things not resolving themselves cleanly. She stayed 20 minutes, long enough to drink the tea he put in front of her without asking, long enough to tell Marcus, briefly and without most of the details, that the situation was being handled through the right channels and that he should focus on the textbook in front of him, which caused him to look at the textbook like it had said something offensive. Long enough to tell Mr. Reeves that she needed the folder he'd put somewhere safe and that she needed it before 8 in the morning. He went to the back room and came back with the folder. He'd put it in a bag from the hardware store down the street, sealed with tape, and he handed it to her with both hands in the way of someone handing over something they were trusting you with rather than something they were glad to be rid of. She put it in her bag. She drove to her office. She worked until 6:45 in the morning. The forensic accountant called her back at 2:30, and they talked for 90 minutes, and by the end of it, she had a document that traced Seven Rivers development from its original capitalization through its dissolution and reinstatement, through 11 subsidiary structures, to the beneficial ownership layer that bore Min Jae's name, but carried, in the filing metadata and the proxy authorization sequence, the specific fingerprints of someone who had been very careful and not quite careful enough. The accountant was 61 years old and had the voice of a man who was genuinely annoyed by financial fraud, the way other people were annoyed by loud neighbors, and listening to him work through it was like listening to someone dismantle a machine piece by piece, naming each component and explaining exactly what it did wrong. At 4 in the morning, she drafted the affidavit. It was 14 pages. She read it twice, cut it to 11, read it again. At 5:30, she compiled the full evidence package. The drive, the briefcase documents, the photographs she'd taken of Mr. Reeves's folder, the affidavit, and the forensic accountant's preliminary analysis. She made 3 copies, one for Delacroix, One for the civil court clerk she'd called, who would file it in the existing fraud matter as supplementary discovery. One she encrypted and sent to a cloud address she'd had since law school that she used for exactly this kind of contingency. The kind of contingency she'd told herself she would never actually face. At 6:30, she changed the bandage on her arm in the bathroom of her office, using supplies from the first aid kit she kept in her desk drawer, because she'd learned over the years that the world occasionally required a first aid kit. The bruising had come up fully overnight, dark purple from mid-forearm to near the elbow, with a yellowish border that would get worse before it got better. She pressed it gently and hissed through her teeth and put the fresh bandage on and rolled her sleeve down and went back to her desk and drank cold coffee and looked at the 11-page affidavit and thought about whether there was anything she'd missed. There was one thing. She thought about it for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she'd used exactly once before, 8 months ago, on a different case. It rang 5 times before it picked up. "This is Nia Brooks," she said. "I need to know if Daniel Cho has legal representation." A pause. "It's 6:40 in the morning." "I know what time it is." Another pause. "He reached out last night. He hasn't retained anyone yet." "Tell him I'm not available to represent him," she said. "But tell him that what he told the room last night on the record in front of witnesses. That's going to matter. That's going to matter more than he knows right now, and the people he talks to today should understand that." A long pause. "I'll tell him." She hung up. She straightened the papers on her desk. She put the evidence package in her bag alongside Mr. Reeves's folder. She put on her coat and looked at her reflection in the dark window for a moment. The coat, the bag, the bruise starting to show above her collar where the baton had grazed her neck that she hadn't noticed until now, the expression on her face that was tired and certain in equal measure. She went to meet Arthur Delacroix. The Financial Crimes Unit occupied the 6th floor of a building on West Madison that smelled like burned coffee and printer toner, and Delacroix himself was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a desk that suggested he'd been doing this long enough to stop caring whether it looked organized. He shook her hand and looked at her arm and said nothing about it, which she appreciated. She laid out the evidence package in the order she'd assembled it and walked him through it without editorializing, because that was how she'd learned to present complex information, not as a story she was telling, but as a sequence of facts she was placing before someone else and trusting them to assemble correctly. Investigators who felt they were being led tended to pull back. Investigators who felt they were discovering tended to lean in. Delacroix leaned in. He asked good questions. The kind of questions that told her he'd already looked at what Han's anonymous submission contained and had spent part of his night thinking about the gaps in it. He was particularly interested in the proxy authorization, particularly interested in the metadata analysis from the forensic accountant, and very specifically interested in the timeline, the dissolution and reinstatement of Seven Rivers Development, the Cho termination date, the rezoning petition filing 3 weeks ago. "The hearing is in 10 days, she said. "I know." He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "The petition was filed by a development group called Lakefront Partners. You know it?" "First time I'm hearing it." "It's clean," he said. "On the surface. 2-year-old company, legitimate principles, no obvious connection to any of this." He picked up the forensic accountant's analysis and read a specific line. "But if your accountant is right about the capital flow through the subsidiary structure, he is. Then Lakefront Partners received its initial capitalization from a source that traces to one of the Seven Rivers subsidiaries, which means whoever controls Seven Rivers effectively controls the entity that's going to profit from the rezoning." He set the paper down. "Which is currently documented as Min J." "Which is fraudulently documented as Min J," she said. "The actual control path goes through Han Seok Rim." Delacroix looked at her. "You understand that making that case is not simple. Nothing about this is simple. You've got a forged proxy authorization and a metadata analysis and a timeline that's suggestive. That's a foundation. It's not a building yet." "I know." She held his gaze. "What would make it a building?" He thought for a moment. "Daniel Cho's direct testimony," he said, "on the record, about who gave him the instruction to sign the proxy authorization and backdate the reinstatement filing." She looked at her hands. "I made a call at 6:40 this morning." Delacroix looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear the timing on that," I didn't tell him what to say, she said. I told him that what he already said last night in front of witnesses would matter. That's all. Another long moment. He picked up his glasses, put them back on, picked up the affidavit, and read the second page. Han-seok Rim has retained counsel as of 4 o'clock this morning. I'd expect that. His lawyer is already characterizing last night as an unauthorized gathering and arguing that anything said or produced in that setting is inadmissible. The briefcase documentation was in Han's possession voluntarily. He brought it to a meeting he called. He distributed copies of it to 12 witnesses. She kept her voice even. The drive was provided to me before your investigation opened by a source with the authority to share materials from his own organization's records. The affidavit documents my chain of custody. None of that was produced in an illegal search. Delacroix looked at her. You've thought about this a lot in the last 6 hours, he said. I haven't slept, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. He closed the evidence package and put his hands flat on the desk and looked at the window behind her for a moment. The rezoning hearing. If it proceeds and the petition is approved before we can establish the fraudulent capital connection. The development deal closes, the properties transfer at inflated value, the shell structure dissolves, and the money is gone before the investigation catches up to it. She paused. I know. We need a freeze on the petition. I know that too. Can you? I have a filing in civil court that goes in this morning as supplementary discovery in an existing fraud matter. If the judge grants the discovery motion, we can request an injunction on any real estate transactions connected to the subject properties pending resolution. She picked up her bag. The clerk is expecting the filing at 9. Delacroix stared at her. You drafted all of this last night. This morning, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the evidence package on his desk, and then at her, and then at the window, and then back at her, and she could see him working through the legal architecture of it, testing the joints, looking for the places it could fail. There's a person in my office, he said carefully, who has been working the property acquisition angle from the city planning side for about 4 months. She's been looking at the Lakefront Partners filing, and she's had the same feeling about it that investigators get when something looks clean and smells wrong. He paused. If I brought her into this conversation, bring her in, Nia said. The woman's name was Sandra Mitch, and she was 44 and sharp, and had the specific energy of someone who had been sitting on a thread she wasn't allowed to pull yet. And when Nia spread the evidence package across the conference table, and Sandra saw the capital flow chart from the forensic accountant, she said one word under her breath that was not suitable for a professional setting and immediately apologized. Nia told her not to. They worked for 3 hours. The civil court filing went in at 9:12, 11 minutes late, and the clerk called to confirm receipt and to tell Nia, in the clipped tone of someone delivering good news, they were professionally obligated not to editorialize, that the judge had flagged it for priority review given the pending rezoning timeline. At 11:40, Daniel Cho called Arthur Delacroix's office. Nia was not in the room for that conversation. She sat in the hallway outside on a bench with her bag in her lap and her wrapped arm across her stomach. And she sat very still, and she did not think about anything in particular because thinking about anything in particular right now was not useful, and what was useful was sitting still and letting the process do what the process did. Delacroix came out at 12:50. He stood in the hallway and looked at her and said, he corroborated the proxy authorization. He identified Han-seok Rim as the person who gave the instruction. He has a record of the communication, a message exchange, which he retained. A pause. He said he kept it because he knew, even at the time, that he was going to need it eventually. Nia sat with that. He's going to need a deal, she said. He's going to get one, Delacroix said. What he gave us is the keystone. She nodded. Ms. Brooks? He looked at her with the expression of a man choosing his words deliberately. Han's lawyer has been calling this office since 8 this morning, arguing that you were present at an illegal assembly last night where you participated in the coercion of a syndicate figure. He's trying to get you in front of a different investigator before we can finish building this. She looked up. I'm mentioning it, Delacroix said, because in my experience, when opposing counsel moves that fast and that specifically, it means they're more afraid of the person they're targeting than they want to appear. He paused. I thought you should know. Thank you, she said. The injunction request goes before the judge at 3 o'clock, he said. I'll have someone in that courtroom. She stood up. Her legs were stiffer than she expected. The hours on the bench, the night before, the arm, all of it compounding into the specific physical language of a body that had been asked to run past its preferences. She stood up anyway, the way she always stood up, because the alternative was not something she engaged with. I'll be there at 3, she said. She was. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Chen, who had the economy of expression of someone who had been listening to arguments for 30 years and had developed an accurate internal filter for which ones merited extended deliberation. She read the filings. She asked 4 questions. She looked at the capital flowchart from the forensic accountant for a long time, in silence, with the stillness of someone doing real work rather than performing consideration. She granted the injunction. All real estate transactions connected to the subject properties and to the Lakefront Partners petition were frozen pending the outcome of the financial crimes investigation. The rezoning hearing was suspended indefinitely. Nia sat in the courtroom and heard the ruling and felt something that wasn't quite relief. Relief was too simple for what it was. It was more like the specific sensation of setting down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time. The weight was gone, but your arms still remembered it. Your body still knew the shape of carrying it. She sat there for a moment after the room had started to move and people were gathering papers and standing, and she sat with the shape of the last 48 hours and felt the weight of them, and then she got up and walked out. She called Mr. Reeves from the courthouse steps. The fraudulent debt agreement is going to be dissolved, she told him. The investigation is open. I can't give you a timeline, but I can tell you that the people responsible for what happened to your store and to 30 other businesses in those neighborhoods are going to have to account for it. He was quiet for a moment. The other stores, he said. The ones that closed. I'm working on that, she said. The recovery piece is harder, but I'm working on it. There's a pharmacy on Ashland, he said. Woman named Grace. She's been in trouble for 16 months. You know about her? She thought about Captain Yoon, his cousin's wife. I know about her. She's a good woman, Mr. Reeves said. She shouldn't have to... He stopped, started again. Thank you, Nia. She almost said it was her job. She stopped herself because it wasn't, not entirely. It wasn't her job to go to a grocery store at 9 o'clock on a rainy night because a 73-year-old man was frightened. It wasn't her job to walk into a warehouse in River North and put a case together in the dark. It wasn't her job to spend the night building an affidavit and calling a forensic accountant at 2 in the morning and sitting in a federal building hallway on a bench with a bruised arm waiting for a corroboration she couldn't have guaranteed would come. Some of it was her job. The rest of it was something else, something she didn't have a clean professional word for. Take care of Marcus, she said. He's going to drive me insane, Mr. Reeves said, with the warmth of a man describing his favorite problem. He's been asking about law school. She smiled. It surprised her. She hadn't expected to smile today, hadn't felt it coming. Tell him to call me in 4 years, she said. She hung up. She stood on the courthouse steps in the November afternoon, the city going around her in all its layers and velocities, and she thought about what came next. There was a lot that came next. The investigation would take months. The civil recovery cases would take longer. Han's lawyer would file motions and arguments, and she would need to be ready for each one. And Min Jai's name on the Seven Rivers structure would need to be formally addressed in a way that was legally complicated and would require careful handling that she hadn't fully mapped out yet. There was a lot that came next. But the injunction was in. The investigation was open. Daniel Cho had spoken. The keystone was out of Han's wall, and the wall was coming down, and the rest of it, the months of legal work, the recovery filings, the testimony, all of it, was the kind of work she knew how to do. That was her ground. She knew how to stand there. She walked to her car. 3 weeks passed the way legal processes passed, in documents and phone calls and waiting rooms, and the specific grinding discipline of building a case one verified fact at a time. Han Seok-rim's lawyer was as aggressive as Delacroix had predicted, filing 4 separate motions to suppress in the first 10 days, all of which were denied. The financial crimes investigation expanded to include 2 additional investigators and a forensic audit team from the state attorney's office. Sandra Mitch became the primary investigator on the Lakefront Partners angle and moved fast and without visible enjoyment, the way good investigators moved. Daniel Cho's cooperation agreement was formalized in the second week. He provided 11 hours of recorded testimony, covering the proxy authorization, 4 other document falsifications, and 3 years of Han's secondary operation that overlapped with but was entirely distinct from Min Jae's organizational activities. His testimony was specific, consistent, and thoroughly corroborated by the materials from the briefcase and the drive. Han Seok-rim was formally charged at the end of the 3rd week. 14 counts: fraud, extortion, conspiracy, money laundering, and the additional charge that Sandra Mitch had been working toward from her side: criminal interference with a government proceeding, specific to the rezoning petition. Nia was not in the building when the charges were filed. She was in a courtroom 3 miles away, filing a civil recovery motion on behalf of Grace Yoon, the pharmacist on Ashland, and 4 other businesses whose fraudulent debt agreements had been documented and traced back to the shell structure. The motion asked for full recovery of payments made under duress, plus damages, plus the legal fees that had accumulated in the time it took for any of this to become actionable. The judge set the hearing date. She walked out of that courtroom and stood in the hallway and thought, 22 months, 31 businesses, a pharmacy on Ashland, a grocery store on a corner in the rain. She thought about the 2 businesses that had closed permanently, and she allowed herself to feel the specific, unglamorous weight of that. The fact that for those 2 families, the injunction and the charges and the civil recovery motion came too late. That was the part of the story that didn't get to resolve cleanly. That was the part she had to carry forward, not to punish herself with, but to remember, because remembering was what kept the next situation from becoming the last one. Min Jae's name was formally cleared from the Seven Rivers beneficial ownership structure in the 4th week, following the forensic audit's conclusion that the reinstatement filing had been executed fraudulently. He was not charged with any crime in connection with the investigation. He was not cooperative with investigators beyond what his lawyer advised, and what his lawyer advised turned out, in this instance, to be exactly sufficient. She did not see him during those 4 weeks. She had no reason to, and she made no effort to create one, and she thought about that deliberately enough to recognize that she was making a choice rather than defaulting into an absence. She was making a choice. In the 5th week, on a Thursday afternoon in December, when the city had finally committed to cold in the full, declarative way of Chicago December, not the suggestion of cold, but the fact of it, complete and settled, she was walking back from the civil court filing office to her car when she passed the intersection of State and Wacker, and he was there. Not dramatically, not arranged. He was standing on the opposite corner with his coat collar up against the wind, and he appeared to be waiting for the light, and when the light changed, he looked across the intersection and saw her. At the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved for a second. The crowd moved around both of them in both directions, the usual indifferent flow of a downtown intersection at 3 in the afternoon, people with places to be who had no interest in whatever was happening at the edges of their movement. He looked at her from across the intersection with the expression she'd come to understand as his baseline, that quiet reading look, the look that was always doing more than it showed. She thought about what it had taken to read that expression correctly, and what it had cost to be in the room where she'd first had to try. She thought about the warehouse, the folding tables, the 12 men, the drive in her coat pocket, his hand holding it out to her, the question of whether to take it, the weight of the decision compressed into the space between his hand and hers. She thought about what he'd said at the door, that he'd come to her building that first night, not just because she was useful, but because he didn't know what else to do, and that he hadn't not known what to do in a very long time. She thought about the things he'd withheld and what the withholding had cost, and whether she had an uncomplicated feeling about any of it. She did not have an uncomplicated feeling about any of it. The light was still green. Neither of them had crossed. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced something small. She couldn't see what from across the intersection. And he placed it on the corner of the signal post beside him, the flat horizontal surface of it, and then he put his hands back in his pockets and looked at her for a moment more. Then he turned and walked in the direction he'd been heading, and the crowd absorbed him, and he was gone. She crossed the intersection. On the signal post, held in place against the December wind by its own weight, was a business card. Simple. Cream-colored. A name and a phone number. Nothing else. Not his name, Roche. A lawyer's name. The kind of card that said, without saying it, here is something that might be useful to you. Here is a resource, offered without obligation. Here is the only kind of thing I know how to give you that doesn't complicate the work you're already doing. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. She put it in her pocket. She walked to her car in the December cold, and the city moved around her as cities did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the magnificent indifference that was also its own kind of honesty. And she thought about 31 businesses, and a boy with taped glasses who was apparently thinking about law school, and a pharmacist on Ashland who had been paying $800 a month for 16 months because she didn't know where else to go, and an elderly man who kept a hardware store bag in his back room for the things he needed to protect. She thought about courage, which was not the thing people described in the moments when it looked clean and decisive from the outside. Courage, in her experience, was mostly the accumulation of smaller things. The phone you answered at 8:47 at night, the door you opened at 2 in the morning, the room you walked into at 8:43 knowing you weren't supposed to be in it, the affidavit you drafted when your arm was throbbing and the coffee was cold, and there was no version of the next 6 hours that didn't require you to be more than you were tired of being. It was the can you picked up off the floor and put back on the shelf. Then the next one. Then the one after that. She got in her car. She started it. She looked at the intersection in her rearview mirror for a moment. Just the intersection, traffic and pedestrians and signal lights cycling through there in different sequence. And then she looked forward. She had a 3 o'clock call with the forensic accountant about the civil recovery numbers. She had a filing to review for Grace Yoon's case. She had a message from the law school clinic she volunteered at twice a month, asking if she could take a client meeting Friday. She had work. She always had work. She pulled out into traffic and the city closed behind her, and the December light came flat and cold through the windshield, and she drove. 6 months later, Reeves's grocery reopened. It had been closed for renovation since January, not because it had to be, but because a settlement payment arrived in February as part of the civil recovery process, and Mr. Reeves had decided at 73 years old that he was going to fix the floor he'd been meaning to fix for a decade and repaint the walls the green his wife had always wanted before she passed, and put in the proper refrigeration unit that had been making that noise for 3 years. The reopening was not an event. Mr. Reeves did not want an event. He opened the door at 7 in the morning, the way he'd opened it every morning for 31 years. And the neighborhood came in and bought things, and the children who came in after school bought candy from the rack near the register, and Marcus, who was behind the counter helping until his own school let out, found that his tape-repaired glasses had finally given up and been replaced by new frames, wire-rimmed, which he wore with the self-consciousness of someone who wasn't sure yet whether they suited him. Nia came by at noon. She bought a cup of coffee from the machine near the door and stood at the counter and talked to Mr. Reeves about nothing in particular. About the weather, about a legal matter she couldn't specify involving a building down the street, about the fact that the new refrigeration unit sounded, Mr. Reeves said, like a refrigeration unit was supposed to sound and not like something being murdered. She was there for 20 minutes. When she left, she stood outside the store for a moment on the sidewalk. The corner looked like a corner again. The laundromat to the left still shuttered, but with a new sign in the window that said something about renovation and an expected reopening in the spring. The barbershop to the right had its door propped open despite the March cold. 2 kids were on the corner doing what kids did on corners, and down the block a woman was walking a dog that was trying to eat a pigeon, and the woman was trying to prevent this with the resigned energy of someone who had been having this argument with this dog for a long time. Chicago in March. The suggestion of a season that hadn't fully committed. The light doing that thing it did in the early months, flat and tentative, like it wasn't sure yet what it was going to be. She walked to her car. She did not look back at the store. She had a 2 o'clock appointment, a new client, referred by the civil court clerk, a family-owned restaurant 3 blocks from the old Seven Rivers corridor that had received a notice about a municipal code violation that they believed had been generated fraudulently. Probably nothing to do with Han's network, which was largely dismantled and processing through the legal system in the slow, grinding way of complex financial crimes cases, but possibly something. She had learned over the last 6 months that possibly something was always worth looking at, that the thing you looked at carefully and found to be nothing was still worth having looked at, because the habit of looking was the whole point, the habit of paying attention, of showing up, of sitting across from the person who was frightened and saying, "Tell me what happened," from the beginning. She got in her car. On the seat beside her from a coffee run that morning was a cup she hadn't finished. Cold now. She drank it anyway, the last 2 inches of it, because cold coffee was still coffee, and she was not in the position to be selective about such things at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday in March. She looked at the street in front of her. She thought briefly about a rainy night in October, and a man who had arrived smiling when everyone expected him to arrive angry, and about what that small particular choice had meant, not just for the outcome, but for everything the outcome had depended on. The way a single decision made in a single moment could be the thing that the next 6 months balanced on without anyone knowing it at the time. She thought about what she'd told Mr. Reeves on the courthouse steps. The rest of it was the kind of work she knew how to do. She started the car. She did not think about it anymore because the 2 o'clock was waiting and the client was frightened and someone needed to sit across from them and say, "Tell me what happened, from the beginning." And she was, as she had always been, the person who showed up to do that. She drove south through the March city, and the light came flat through the windshield, and ahead of her, the road went on being the road, and Chicago went on being Chicago, and somewhere across the city a grocery store smelled like fresh paint and proper refrigeration and the very specific, uncomplicated warmth of a place that had decided to stay.